The year is 2026. Income inequality is at an all-time high. AI is replacing entry-level jobs at an alarming rate, and it feels as though the majority of our politicians, this one being the most blatant example, are only empowered to help billionaires get richer and to put money back in their own pockets. These are truly unprecedented times. And one question I know many of us are asking is, when is this all going to end? There's no way we can keep going like this. Things have to change. And I'm here to tell you that they will, because these unprecedented times are actually not as unprecedented as we might think. And I think the best way to predict what's next for America is to not look at the polymarket odds for J.D. Vance versus Gavin Newsom, but to look at something else, the Gilded Age. History might not repeat itself, but it sure as hell rhymes. And I, along with many other YouTubers and historians, believe that we are living in the second Gilded Age. So today, I want to take a look back in our history books to try to predict what's next, and figure out what we can do now to replicate the positive change that came after the first Gilded Age. Because it was probably the most consequential shift in American history, and I want to tell the story as to why and how this massive pendulum swing actually happened. Starting with Reconstruction after the Civil War and going all the way to World War I. But before we dive into things, and speaking of World War I, I want to take just a second to talk about this video's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Supremacy 1914, a free online PvP strategy game set in historic World War I. You can pick your own nation, train troops, manage resources, and build alliances with other players. Compete against up to 499 other players in real time over multiple weeks. I've always been a huge fan of the board game Risk, and if you're also a fan, then you're probably going to have a really good time playing this game. And you can play it for free online with millions of other players around the world. Plus, having that World War I historical aspect to it is a fun little touch. Anyway, if you want to give it a try, it's available on PC and mobile. And if you use my link, you get 50 hero shards for legendary hero Lawrence of Arabia and a premium account for 1 month. That's a $15 value for free just by clicking the link. Offer is valid for the next 30 days. All right, back to it. Hey, it's been a minute. And today, I want to use the Gilded Age to predict what's next for America. Today, the top 1% of Americans control 32% of all the wealth, with the bottom 50% of earners only making up 2.5% of the overall wealth of the country. On top of that, Anthropic's CEO, Dario Amodei, is predicting that AI could eliminate nearly half of all white-collar jobs and raise unemployment rates from the current 4.3% to 20% within the next 5 years. To give you more context, the peak unemployment rate for the 2008 Great Recession was 10%. And of course, our current president, Donald J. Trump, has imposed tariffs that have not only hurt the working class, but have also not helped bring back American manufacturing, which, according to his administration, was the whole point of them. The US has, in fact, lost 72,000 manufacturing jobs since last April. Not to mention, ICE is murdering protesters, news and media are being consolidated at a very fast rate, we're getting Super Bowl ads for mass surveillance software, and our entire government and Western society as a whole is being controlled by a class of pedophilic elites. But hey, at least the Dow is at 50,000.
Dow is over 50,000.
Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein?
Anyway, I know you've been keeping up with the news. You get the picture. Things right now seem pretty damn bleak. But what about the Gilded Age? Do they really have it as bad as we do now? From the 1870s to the early 1900s, Americans also faced rising wealth inequality, billionaires controlled politicians, technological innovation was replacing jobs, everybody hated tariffs, there was a massive recession that wiped out the middle and working class, and there was also militarized police forces murdering Americans in the streets. Really, the only big difference between now and then was they didn't have as many pedophiles in power. That is a unique characteristic of the second Gilded Age. Well, to help draw upon these comparisons between the Gilded Age and today, I decided to consult not only an expert, but also one of my favorite YouTubers, the one and only Mr. Beat. But I would love to start just with comparing the two decades. What were some of those similarities that you came across?
Yeah, I just have been thinking about this a long time. There was one book in particular, I was just reading it and I was like, wow, this sounds a lot like today.
Mr. Beat actually recently made a video comparing the 1890s to the 2020s. So if you want to dive a little bit deeper into the side-by-side comparisons, go check out that video after this one.
And it was the H.W. Brand's book about the 1890s, but he wrote that in the 1990s. And he was comparing that decade to 100 years later, and he was trying to make the connections there. But I was just like, no, man, the 1990s were way different than now.
This era, spanning from the 1870s to the early 1900s, saw a staggering technological metamorphosis. A generation that fought in the Civil War and read letters by candlelight lived to see the adoption of the electric light bulb and witnessed the horse and buggy eclipsed by steam engines and refined petroleum-powered automobiles. In just 30 years, the United States pivoted from an agrarian economy fueled by slave labor and to an industrial titan built on the backs of a massive new immigrant workforce. But at the heart of this transformation was the train. This big boy technology didn't just move people around, it fundamentally reshaped the American West. As the tracks expanded, it facilitated the systematic displacement of Native Americans to make way for a developing empire, while simultaneously creating millions of jobs for a population that surged from 38.5 million in 1870 to over 100 million by 1920. And this rapid expansion gave rise to a new class of Americans. Known as titans of industry to some and robber barons to most, Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Vanderbilt, and Gold are names that have lived long after the Gilded Age. And I'm sure you've heard of most of these. Except Jay Gould. No one remembers Jay Gould.
He doesn't get as much attention as some of the others. Like Rockefeller always gets all the attention, or Carnegie, but Gold was like, I think he did whatever he could to he did whatever he could get away with.
Jay Gould was less a titan of industry and more a ruthless speculator. Rather than fostering competition like a good old capitalist, he specialized in bundling smaller entities to create threats to established monopolies. His most brilliant play was the creation of American Union. In 1881, he sold the company to its rival, Western Union, while simultaneously using the profits to buy enough stock to become Western Union's majority owner. And Gould's playbook remains the blueprint for the modern billionaires of today.
There's a lot of Jay Goulds, unfortunately, today.
So it's clear that the Gilded Age had an extreme amount of wealth inequality, similar to the kind that we're experiencing today. But just how bad was it, actually? Well, let's take a look at someone who was at the lower end of the income scale in the year 1902. According to a 35-year-old American-born anthracite Pennsylvania coal miner, they made $58.94 per month. Their rent was $10.50 per month. Coal to heat and light his house cost $4 per month. No, he did not get free coal as a coal miner. And groceries, which was just bare minimum food to survive, like eggs, butter, ham, flour, and sugar, added up to $22 per month. Plus, he paid his butcher $5 a month, because everybody needs a good butcher. If you're really good at quick math, then you'll know that altogether this Pennsylvania coal miner's cost of living was $42.40 per month, which gave him a total of $16.54 to set aside each month in hopes of saving up enough cash to one day live the American dream. Or at the very least, hope that his kids might get to live it someday. Oh wait, what's that? He has kids? Little Jimmy and Timmy just turned 10 years old? Oh, down to the mines, boys. Yeah, I don't know if the children yearned for the mines. They probably more so yearned to not have black lung, but nevertheless, it was extremely common for children to help out and contribute to the family piggy bank.
You had a lot of kids as young as 6, 7, 8 years old working in factories, some of them getting killed, and the families not getting anything.
In 1900, about 1/5 of children under 15 years old worked in non-agricultural work, and millions of others, unaccounted for, worked on farms. But who cares about kids? Let's look at today and adjust that Pennsylvania coal miner's income for inflation. His annual income of $707.28 adjusted for 2026 is the equivalent of $26,656.40 per year. Now, the current poverty line for a family of 3 in 2026 is $27,300 per year. But let's go back to that coal miner from 1902 and look at the rent that he was paying for a second. He paid $10.50 a month for rent, which made up about 18% of his annual income. If we take the average rent in the US in 2026 for a 900 square foot apartment, assuming you can fit a family of 3 in there, the rent is $1,773 a month, which means that this hypothetical family of 2026 would have to have 78% of their annual income going towards just their rent. Now, obviously, a 900 square foot apartment of today is going to be a lot nicer than the coal miner's family apartment in 1902. But all of this is ignoring the fact that in the span of 124 years, with all of the societal growth, technological innovation, and evolution as a society, we were only able to raise the wages for a lower working class American by about $644 a year. And again, this coal miner in 1902 was poor as hell. like lowest of the low class. And for that working family of 2026, we have to assume that one of the parents can even find a job. I've seen people online compare the coal mines of the Gilded Age to the data centers of today. And yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate comparison. Except the coal mines at least employed people. The data centers that power our AI slop of today might give a development company some cash during its construction, but after that, it just chugs water and electricity, takes entry-level jobs away, and decimates entire communities like Elon's XAI data center outside of Memphis, all while not really employing anybody. Awesome. I love innovation. Take me back to the Gilded Age, baby. By now, I'm sure you're starting to see the similarities between today and the Gilded Age. But there's one major difference between then and now. And I think the more we talk and learn about this differentiating factor, the more hope we will have for what comes after this nightmarish political and economic era we currently find ourselves in. In the 1870s, prior to the Second Industrial Revolution, there was really no such thing as a giant corporation or a massive business that employed thousands of workers. So when these titans of industry like Gold and Vanderbilt started growing railroad companies and banks and accumulating unimaginable wealth, it started to create a larger divide between the owners and managers of these companies and the workers who were employed under them.
You had long hours. This is before the idea of overtime mostly. In fact, people were just starting to bring up the idea of the 40-hour work week, 8 hours a day, dividing up the day into threes, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of fun, 8 hours of sleep. This was brand new in the 1880s, 1890s.
I'm going to keep picking on Jay Gould for a minute because everyone hated him back then, and I might as well keep the trend going 100 years later. But in the 1880s, Gould believed that capital and labor, if let alone, generally would come together and mutually regulate their relations to each other. He thought the idea of unions or strikes would create tensions that would not otherwise be there. A lot of workers accepted this as just the way of life, but others started to think that this philosophy coming from Gould kind of really only benefited those who were already in power. During this time, America had become an industrialized nation, and it was really proud of it. On the global stage, it was no longer a collection of agrarian towns, but was becoming instead a beacon of technological innovation and extreme urban growth. So the idea of an organized labor movement fighting back against these giant companies sort of represented a disorder and went against the narrative of America being all grown up and ready to be an industrial nation. Workers' interests not only risked destroying a cool big new company, but also risked destroying the idea of the United States. But whenever there was economic hardship, like the Panic of 1873, the workers of these companies would respond.
You started to have workers organize, and sometimes they'd go on strike.
And in this specific case, things escalated to a boiling point. And honestly, I can't believe we didn't talk about this more in history class.
If we recall, it didn't usually end so well for the workers.
In July of 1877, strikes broke out in Maryland and West Virginia on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The strikes erupted because earlier that month, the railroads cut their employees' wages by 10% for the second time in the past 4 years. Again, this was during a huge economic depression. The firemen and brakemen who worked for the railroad basically said, yeah, you can't do that because I literally don't make enough money to live anymore. So they walked off the job and refused to let the trains run anymore. So the governor of West Virginia was like, well, we got to get these trains running. Why don't I just send a bunch of West Virginia militiamen to do it? It can't be that hard. So the militiamen showed up and started chatting with the workers who were on strike, and they were like, yeah, I mean, we're not working because our boss just cut our wages and we can't afford to buy food anymore. And the militiamen were like, are you f***ing serious, dude? That's bullshit. Actually, yeah, f*** that. You know what? We're going to strike with y'all. The leader of the militia even said, quote, we may be militiamen, but we are workmen first. God damn, how fucking badass is that? They need to make like a Top Gun style movie about this strike. Gay beach volleyball scene and all. But things didn't end there. The West Virginia governor was like, okay, well, these militia guys suck and they're a bunch of poor people sympathizers. I'll just go to President Rutherford B. Hayes and see if he'll give me some federal troops to deploy to stop them. Well, Rutherford said, yeah, sure, no problem. Well, the federal troops rolled up into Baltimore, and the strikers started building barricades in the streets. And then all of the skilled laborers of Baltimore saw all of these strikers and saw all of these pompous, wealthy people observing this class warfare that was about to break out, and they were like, wait, we hate these rich people too. We may not work for them because we're, shoe cobblers and butchers, but you know what? We're going to fight with the strikers. The streets quickly erupted with violence. The crowd of strikers and laborers began setting fires and pelting the troops with bricks and stones. One federal troop decided to fire back, killing a protester, and then all hell broke loose. In the end, 250 people were arrested, 16 were injured, and 10 died. And then a chain reaction across the United States began. Strikes started spreading like wildfire all over the country, starting in Philadelphia, where federal troops brought 2 rapid-fire Gatling guns and shot into the crowd, killing 20 people. After this, the entire Northeast and Midwest started to shut down, with strikers and sympathizers halting almost all rail transport and filling the streets, essentially laying siege to these cities. Albany, Buffalo, Newark, Trenton, Chicago, Erie, Altoona, Harrisburg, Columbus, Cincinnati, Fort Wayne, Kansas City. This thing was getting huge. Prior to this, Americans thought that Native Americans were the only force that could challenge the United States military power within the country. But now the U.S. had a new enemy, one that they were much more afraid of, because without them, this whole industrialization thing would stop working. They called this new group the dangerous class.
These factory owners, these giant companies would just hire private security or paramilitary forces to squash these strikes.
A bunch of northeastern businesses and corporations were very scared by this whole thing and thought that if only each state had about 25,000 highly trained troops, then this would never happen again. And thus, backed by donations from businessmen, the National Guard was created. Kind of. They technically existed before as state militias, but after the railroad strike, they were much more heavily funded and shaped into what our modern National Guard looks like today. So next time Trump threatens to send the National Guard to a city because of protesters and you think, hey, that's not what they're supposed to be used for, technically and historically, that is kind of what they were used for. It definitely doesn't justify it, though. The strike really did change the course of American history and woke up the country to this hidden anger that was persisting throughout the poor and working people of the U.S. Prior to this, America was seen as a country that didn't really struggle with class conflict like those other countries over in Europe. To most working people across the U.S., the strike showed the real strength of laborers working together, and many saw it as a message of hope in an otherwise bleak time of immense wealth inequality. This sparked workers to start trying to come up with remedies to fix this class war, and that naturally led many activists and laborers into the world of politics. The thought was that if working class people and leaders could start running for higher office, then maybe they could enact policies that would shrink the wealth gap and make laborers' lives just a little bit better. But to win in US politics, you need a party. And at the moment, the Republicans and the Democrats didn't really have working people top of mind. To most politicians at the time, workers were seen more as a violent mob that could crack at any moment, and there wasn't really a plan to do anything to help them, besides sending troops to squash their strikes. This led many American voters to turn to parties outside of the Republicans and the Democrats, searching for politicians that wanted to put the interest of labor first, like the Greenback Party. Greenbackism strove to restore labor rights and bring justice to the economic system. At first, the party fared pretty poorly on the national stage, only receiving like 80,000 votes across the country in 1876. But after the railroad strike of 1877, class consciousness was strengthening across the country. And the next year, in 1878, they received 870,000 votes in total and were able to elect 15 Greenbackers to Congress and a ton of local and state officials as well. The U.S. voting base was finally waking up, and all laborers and skilled workers began banding together to campaign and back politicians and political organizations that would put the 99% of Americans first. But what did these parties want exactly? What policy proposals did they have planned that would create a more equal way of life during the Gilded Age? See, the Democratic Party of this time started going through some major changes. And although they had just won their first election in the past 30 years, they were still trying to figure out what type of party they were going to be, post-Civil War and post-pro-slavery. And this marked the beginning of the party's sort of flipping and changing their ideology. After the unpopular Grover Cleveland, the Democrats needed a new nominee to run for president, and they landed on this young 36-year-old named William Jennings Bryan. Now, unlike old Grover, Bryan was also nominated by the growing left-wing Populist Party, which brought an entire new voting bloc into the Democratic Party. Bryan was a free silver Democrat, meaning that he was in favor of the unlimited coinage of silver into the money supply. Silver became known as the people's money, and was heavily aligned with populism, unions, and just about anyone who opposed big banks and robber barons. But the more conservative side of the Democrats, also known as the Gold Democrats, did not really like Bryan. Even Grover Cleveland himself, a Gold Democrat, privately favored the Republican nominee, William McKinley, for president.
A lot of people were threatened by William Jennings Bryan. They knew that they would be losing money potentially, because he talked about things like an income tax. We didn't have income taxes in 1896.
It's all tariffs.
Yeah, these rich people were like, well, hold on. And so they spent a lot of money against him.
So since the Democratic Party was pretty split on backing Bryan, there wasn't a ton of money and financing that went into his campaign. So Bryan had to get a little innovative, and he thought, you know what? Why don't I just travel throughout the country and give speeches directly to the American voters and just tell them what I want to do as president? Huh. That's a pretty good idea, Bryan.
You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
During his campaign, Bryan would go on to give over 600 speeches, reaching around 5 million Americans across 27 different states, thus inventing the National Stumping Tour, which obviously went on to later become a very vital part of presidential campaigning. I mean, try to imagine someone running for president and not giving speeches in swing states. But unfortunately, with the amount of financing and funding the Republican Party had, plus the conservative side of the Democrats not really fully backing Bryan, William McKinley would win the election and become president. But Bryan would become the youngest person in U.S. history, still to this day, to receive an electoral college vote. And many didn't know it at the time, but he had just shifted the Democratic Party forever. He may have just been a little early to the party. Pun intended. But this was not the end for William Jennings Bryan. He went on to run again in 1900 against William McKinley, again, and for a third time in 1908 against William Howard Taft. Bryan would campaign as the pro-labor candidate, advocating for graduated income tax, women's suffrage, the 8-hour workday, federal regulations for telegraphs, telephones, and railroad companies, and stricter antitrust laws. As I'm sure you're thinking right now, hey, didn't we eventually get all those things? Well, yeah. We sure did.
The reason why William Jennings Bryan didn't win the third time he ran was because by this time, both of the major political parties, the Democrats and Republicans, were populist parties or progressive parties. He was becoming irrelevant because his views had become the mainstream.
William Jennings Bryan may have never been president, but his policy proposals and his advocacy, which seemed radical at the time, would later go on to become staples of the Democratic Party's values and really pave the way for the progressive era after the Gilded Age. Mr. Beat put it best.
It just sounds like he could have been Bernie Sanders.
William Jennings Bryan really was our modern day Bernie Sanders.
He was just saying stuff that was timeless, that it just fits this era so well.
Before Bernie began his campaign for president in 2016, we can see that Americans' view on the government being responsible for healthcare coverage was hovering around 45% being in favor and 52% being against government coverage. Now, about 10 years later, only 33% of Americans are against government coverage and 64% are in favor of it. And back in 2016, Bernie was the first modern presidential candidate to talk about the rising cost of private healthcare in the U.S. and advocate for government-funded universal healthcare.
One major country, the United States, which ends up spending almost 3 times per capita what they do in the UK, guaranteeing healthcare to all people, 50% more than they do in France, guaranteeing healthcare to all people, far more than our Canadian neighbors who guarantee healthcare to all people. Please do not tell me that in this country, if, and here's the if, we have the courage to take on the drug companies and have the courage to take on the insurance companies and the medical equipment suppliers. If we do that, yes, we can guarantee health care to all people in a much more cost-effective way.
But kind of like William Jennings Bryan back in 1896, the more conservative wing of the Democratic Party didn't align themselves with him and saw his policy proposals as too radical for the time.
The last thing we need is to throw our country into a contentious debate about health care again. And we are not England. We are not France.
It only takes one person on the national stage to bring up a problem that most Americans can relate to and then offer a solution for it. And I don't see universal health care becoming less popular over the next 10 years. Just like how William Jennings Bryan antitrust advocacy didn't either.
William Jennings Bryan, in my opinion, is the most effective presidential candidate in history. You know, he may have lost all these elections, but he had such a huge influence, it didn't matter.
I mean, it became so transparent that these robber barons were gobbling up competition, playing with the stock market, and directly causing the panic of 1907, another recession, that Teddy Roosevelt, who was president at the time and very much a conservative politician, got so pissed at these business tycoons for causing the recession that he became a trust buster and anti-monopoly advocate almost overnight.
The panic of 1907, that was definitely a tipping point. But even if you go back further, there's little signs that he's just like, you know, he's more willing to go after these corporations.
He even started siding with unions and strikers because he realized how unpopular these giant corporations were becoming and how much they were damaging American livelihoods.
After 1907, you know, you flash forward to 1912, and he's calling for things like universal health care. It's just kind of this crazy how dramatically he shifted to the left, and I think it was more related to his ego than anything. I hate to say that because I do like Roosevelt, despite his imperialism. I think that, yeah, he was just, he had a personal vendetta against some of these guys who were just not only causing the economy to crash, but then like asking the government, all governments, state and federal, to bail them out.
And so, yeah, in a weird roundabout way, Teddy was the first truly progressive president and helped usher in the progressive era and the end of the Gilded Age. So what was the outcome here? I'm going to assume that many of you clicked on this video hoping for a little bit of good news. Jay Gould and Rockefeller and Carnegie all eventually died off, right? We're not going to be stuck with these dweeb corporate overlords forever. Surely they're not going to be able to host a never-ending yacht party on Epstein Island. And the answer is actually, yeah, it did end. The Gilded Age did lead to a period of progressive reform in which marginalized working communities actually scored concrete political victories. Graduated progressive federal income tax brackets were introduced in 1913 following the ratification of the 16th Amendment and the passage of the Revenue Act of 1913. For the first time in U.S. history, the super wealthy actually began having to pay their fair share. The Socialist Party surged in popularity, actually capturing 6% of the presidential vote in 1912. And now look, 6% may not seem like a lot, but in a country where the word socialist has been bastardized to essentially be used as a pejorative, 6% might actually be the closest that the party ever gets. I like this quote from two New York union workers during the period. People got mighty sick of voting for Republicans and Democrats when it was a heads I win, tails you lose proposition. And another New York City businessman explained that he was a socialist because it's the only way out of our miserable mess, and because the old parties are flim-flamming us all the time. Furthermore, the Woodrow Wilson New Freedom agenda introduced a wave of federal regulation, with William Jennings Bryan actually as his Secretary of State leading some of these changes. They targeted monopolies through the creation of the Federal Reserve, a central banking to manage the money supply, the establishment of the FTC as a bipartisan agency to investigate and halt unfair methods of competition in interstate commerce, and the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act to halt price discrimination. Crucially, unions were exempt from the Clayton Act, protecting union organizing, collective bargaining, and activities like strikes or boycotts from being considered illegal conspiracies in restraint of trade. All of this legislation laid the groundwork for progress that would later be realized in FDR's New Deal.
Union membership, if I recall correctly, didn't peak until after World War II. And so there's kind of this misconception when we teach about the progressive era. We're like, oh yeah, union membership skyrocketed, and this is when workers really gained a lot of leverage. I think the progressive era was more of just the beginning of workers gaining rights.
Now, I have to say, I desperately want to believe that some of these same reforms that characterize the response to the Gilded Age will also emerge from our modern politics. But I can't help but be struck by something Mr. Beat mentioned in our interview.
Today, these companies are so huge that it's really difficult for, even though we outnumber them, we depend on them. It's like, okay, say you have a part of your body that's like itching really badly. Like say your left arm is itching and so bad that you can't But what are you going to do without it? You depend on it. You need it to, you need to use your arm. And so that's the challenge that remains, I think, in the 2020s.
He described the ubiquity of megacorporations as an itch you can't help but scratch. Indeed, late-stage capitalism can feel so embedded within American society as to be inescapable. How can we attain the class consciousness necessary to band together and fight back against these oligarchs when we often spend more time scrolling on Instagram or shopping on Amazon than engaging with our fellow human beings? But there's something that we have today that they did not have during the Gilded Age.
But at least we have the internet. I mean, a lot of people do confide, personal stuff online to strangers, and we're all going through the same thing. And I think that's why it was surprising to some people, especially to see what happened recently in places like Los Angeles and Minneapolis, because I think some people, especially that lean to the right, they're just like, we didn't see that coming. That many people just in the streets all joining forces like that.
And you know what? Before talking to Mr. Beat, I was a little more cynical about the power of the internet being used for good, but I think I agree with him. I think that it holds tremendous potential as maybe the one unifying force in our society.
Sure, we're isolated, but and we may be isolated from our coworkers, but I think as fellow citizens, I think we're still connected in many ways, thankfully, because of the internet.
So, back to predicting what's next for America. What comes after the second Gilded Age that we're currently in? Do you see the parties flipping again in the next decade like they did at the turn of the century?
I think they're already starting to. I think if you look at 2024, a lot of what Kamala Harris was saying sounded a lot like George W. Bush in 2004. And I mean, look at who endorsed her, the Cheneys. When we talk about changes of platforms, clearly the Republicans have been more open to changing their platform over the past 10 years compared to the Democrats. But like you said, I think the Democrats are finally starting to understand, like, oh yeah, we're going to actually have to be for stuff instead of just against Trump.
Well, during the first Gilded Age, both parties, Republicans and Democrats, weren't offering enough to the majority of workers who made up about 99% of the population. Over time, with more strikes, came more class consciousness. With more class consciousness came more interest in politics. With more interest in politics came elected pro-labor candidates and labor organizations becoming powerful. Powerful enough to force a national party into passing legislation that actually made people's material lives better. The 8-hour workday, the abolition of child labor, and the freaking idea of a weekend didn't come because politicians suddenly decided that it would be nice and sweet to do these things. These rights, along with the Federal Reserve, Social Security, and women being able to vote, just kind of feel like mundane, permanent fixtures of American life today. But they weren't just gifts brought to the American public. They were the hard-won results of decades of pressure from the 99% who forced the government to succumb to their demands. What we currently have is not permanent. I think over the past year, a lot of us have seen how fast and easily a lot of it can break. But also, things can be built. We can ask for more. We can demand things to be better. We don't have to settle for the lesser of two evils. History shows us that the progressive era didn't just follow the Gilded Age because that's the next chapter in my history book. It was ushered in by millions of Americans who fought and died to create a society that was slightly less shitty for the working class. Politicians and political parties didn't decide that things should change. They were merely the vessels in which it was eventually implemented. I believe that we're at a similar crossroads. It truly feels like one era is ending and something is going to come next. And if we're looking at things from a solely historical perspective, if the demands of the majority continue to be ignored, that same class tension that's been building since the 1877 railroad strike will be reignited.
So now you're flash forwarding to 2026, and we have an affordability crisis across the board. And so I think people are more radicalized now, first and foremost because of the economy, but also because of movements that have become radicalized online. I just think that we're at a point now where it's something big has to happen. I don't know what exactly that's going to look like, but probably going to happen within the next 10 years. and it's comparable to like either like the 1960s, where you see just a bunch of laws passed to reform society in a very short window, or maybe the progressive era, which your whole video is kind of about. What could make this interesting though is if we do end up having a very bad recession. That would just speed it up, I think. So yeah, it's going to happen. I keep telling everybody we're going to see some big changes in the next few years.
America is past due for another wave of immense progressive change, because history proves that when things don't get better, that pressure eventually has to go somewhere. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully this one wasn't too much of a bummer. It was supposed to be more inspirational. Hopefully it came off that way. And if you want to watch more of that interview with Mr. Beat, I have the entire thing uploaded on my Patreon. It's like 40 minutes long. So if you want to watch that entire thing, you can sign up on my Patreon. A huge thank you to Mr. Beat for being part of this video. I've been watching his channel for like 10 plus years now and have learned a ton from him. So it was pretty amazing to have him be part of this. Thank you, Mr. Beat. And don't forget to check out Supremacy 1914, the free online PvP strategy game set in historic World War I. Engage in battles, strategize, and conquer the world against real player opposition. Click the link in the description and get an exclusive and free starter pack containing a hero medal for level 1 unlock of legendary hero Lawrence of Arabia and 1 month of premium account features. That offer is valid for the next 30 days.